Everyone, thanks for having me. So my name is Jordan Croom. I'm an investor at Sidedoor Ventures focusing on frontier technologies and VP of payloads at Varda Space Industries where we're making pharmaceuticals in space. So this might be a little bit off the beaten track of what was talked about so far in the conference. So I'll start things off with a question here, which is, what do you think of when you think of space? So for some of you, might be your favorite hero or villain from the movies, Yoda, Darth Vader, Tom Hanks. For others, it may be the historical accomplishments of government agencies like NASA, from people on the moon to permanent human presence in low Earth orbit to multiple landings on Mars. Countries around the world have accomplished incredible things in space in the pursuit of science and innovation and national pride. But it may not be clear why it's relevant to you. In fact, I would postulate you wouldn't survive a day without space. It's embedded in every single day in your life. So to make that clear why, start off with an example from my trip down here to Guatemala. So I flew from Los Angeles, and if you're like me, you'd like to be productive on the plane, you might pull out your laptop, try to get some work done, try to answer some emails. But have you ever thought about how that happens? So the plane has an antenna on it that's connecting to a satellite that's 35,000 kilometers above the Earth, communicating with it, transferring your emails all the way there and back to make sure you can stay productive. When I got here, I woke up right on time thanks to my alarm. But how did it know that it was in the right time zone? Well, the phone connects to the cell phone towers. The cell phone towers connect to the GPS satellites, and that allows it to know what region I'm in and what the correct time zone is to make sure I stay on track. When I woke up, I turned on the TV to see what the weather was going to look like. But where did that come from? Well, there's another satellite in orbit communicating with the TV to make sure I get the cable news. And the data source for all that weather information is coming from government subsidized satellites made by people like NASA and ESA to make sure we stay safe and productive. From there, I might have gone outside, got some coffee, figure out where the local restaurants are. But my phone knows exactly where I am because of GPS satellites. And I'm able to transfer data back and forth to the cell phone towers because the GPS is giving a time synchronization to make sure I don't lose any packets. So all this fabric of your life to date has been brought to you by government agencies like NASA, ESA, the Department of Defense, as well as highly leveraged communication companies. Very large communication satellite companies like EchoStar, Intelsat, Viasat, also direct-to-consumer cable TV companies like DirecTV. And why is that? So as an example, I want to point out here Landsat 8. So this is the satellite that was launched in 2013. It collects weather and ground information data. So the satellite alone costs almost $700 million. The launch costs over $100 million. And it took 8 years from the start of the project to deliver the satellite to orbit to complete, and is only going to last 10 years. So huge investment of time and money, requires a lot of one-off engineering, requires a lot of expertise to design these things from scratch. But if you look at the data, you actually notice a big change. You see something happening around 2010 where the number of objects launched in space just skyrockets. So why is that? Well, there's two main factors. One of them is the fact that thanks to our cell phones, thanks to the iPhone, thanks to all the devices that we have and use every day, Moore's Law is making sure that we get high performance components that are really cheap, made at mass scale. It drops the cost, the size, and the lead time for all these satellite components. And you can basically get the same effect as Landsat by dropping components from your iPhone directly into the satellite the size of a shoebox. The second factor here is that SpaceX has innovated in rockets to make it more regular flights, much lower cost. You can see on the right-hand side here a significant drop in cost per kilogram to orbit. If you think back to the space shuttle, that was around $62,000 per kilogram to orbit. SpaceX now offers launches at around $6,000 per kilogram to orbit and launches nearly weekly. And that's not the end of it. SpaceX is working on a much larger rocket, which will drastically increase the amount of mass that goes to orbit, as well as dropping the price from what used to be $62,000 a kilogram down to $100 a kilogram. And I think there's a great analogy here to what happened in the early 1900s, where we see a massive paradigm shift in what we're able to do. I think this is an appropriate comparison here where you see the workers on the Empire State Building, 1932, and the workers on the Starship in 2023. I think the echo effects there are going to be similarly large. So why should you care? You understand now that it affects your daily life. You understand that there's big changes going on in the industry, but is it investable? So there's actually quite a large market in this right now already. The key factors or the key areas right now are infrastructure. Line of sight, so basically the fact that you have a bird's eye view from orbit allows you to provide unique insights to people on the ground, connect with them. And there's also manufacturing to support the industry in the first place. Most of the value to date has been in the communication services, either entertainment or core infrastructure, but there's actually pretty significant markets even for just space vehicles and supporting the industry overall. But there's a lot more beyond that. A little bit more sci-fi, but there's lots of raw materials in orbit, huge chunks of valuable materials like water, metals like platinum that could be recovered from asteroids. That's a little bit more sci-fi, a little bit further out there. But there's also a lot of underutilized resources that are really difficult to connect or to create on Earth. Things like very deep vacuum, extreme low and high temperatures in space. Just by pointing in the right direction, you can have a panel that goes from minus 300 C all the way up to several hundred degrees C just by changing orientation. There's also semi-infinite power. The sun is not attenuated at all by atmospheric effects. And you have 24/7 coverage if you're in the right orbit to generate power at all times. The most interesting one here to me is microgravity. So there's lots of cool things you can do by being able to turn off the switch of gravity that affect really interesting industrial processes. And so it should be no surprise that the World Economic Forum predicts that the space industry will have a TAM greater than $1 trillion by 2030. Okay, so how can you capitalize on these changes? I think it's always interesting to an investor when there's exponential change, when there's significant disruptions in a market. And the key thing to think about, for me at least, is focusing on the foundational drivers for those changes. So the key things we covered here are that there's an exponential drop in the launch cost, there's an exponential increase in launch cadence, there's high performance commodity hardware, basically cell phone technology that's now available readily and cheaply, and there's unique value propositions in space, things that you can't do on Earth. So I want to walk through some of the theses that we have at Side Door Ventures, portfolio companies that we've actually invested in, and kind of my thinking for why we did that. The first one, maybe not the most original thesis. I will say here a caveat, I would bet against Elon on Twitter, but not on SpaceX. So this one is maybe seeming a little bit obvious, but I think it's kind of not fully absorbed by most people just how incredible the advantage and the growth potential SpaceX has and why it's a $100 billion company today. So I'll start with the example of launch. One of their main commercial competitors is Rocket Lab, the only really credible alternative competitor out there. So the SpaceX Falcon 9, you can see their capacity here, 25,000 kilograms to the orbit, 2.5K per kilogram to orbit, launching more than weekly now. Rocket Lab, their closest competitor, can only take 300 kilograms. They cost $25,000 per kilogram, and they're launching around 10 times a year. It's a huge gulf there, and all the other competitors that exist, especially the government ones, are orders of magnitude worse on either cost or cadence. But it gets worse. So in communications, the legacy competitors like EchoStar, I picked an example here, EchoStar Jupiter 3. This is a satellite that was launched in the last couple of years. Very high tech, very advanced. They're getting 500 gigabytes per second downlink for internet applications. It's a $500 million satellite. It costs $70 million to launch. It gets 650 milliseconds of latency, meaning it's so far away from Earth. That's the amount of time it takes for the signal to go up and back down so you can communicate with another node. So that results in about 1 kilobit per second per dollar. Compare that to SpaceX. And you can see here, this stack is about the same size as that satellite over there, but it contains many satellites they launch all at once. This one gets 100 gigabits per second, much lower latency because it's closer to Earth, and results in more than 100x performance in the amount of data you get per dollar. So it should come as no surprise that SpaceX now dominates the launch and satellite industry. They're launching more than one a week. The amount of mass that they put in orbit this year dwarfs the rest of the world combined, not just other companies, not just other governments. They're launching more than any other sovereign state or entity anywhere in the world by multiple factors. So 80% of the mass this year has been delivered by SpaceX. China's around 10%. Everybody in the rest of the world is around 10% as well. And they're not stopping there. Right now, the number of satellites they have in the constellation represents about 30% of satellites ever launched in all of history of mankind. They're going to increase that by a factor of 10 from today in the next few years to fill out the Starlink constellation. And so those are representing the size of the constellation that SpaceX is launching relative to all those satellites that exist. So huge advantage there, and I think it's hard to see how they're not going to generate immense value. So what does that mean for the other companies that they're competing against? I think you can see the launch companies here, basically dead on arrival from my opinion. The highly leveraged communication companies that are worth many billions of dollars each, I think are each in pretty tough territory right now because they don't really have a competitive edge, and SpaceX is coming after them. So there's huge value that investors have invested already that is at risk of going to zero if they're not responsive to this change. And there's others that I think will survive, but more in a niche application. So on the left-hand side here, you see 3 major investments from Jeff Bezos. All that Amazon money is keeping those companies alive, making sure they can compete with SpaceX. OneWeb is a communications constellation that's now subsidized by the European government, the UK, to make sure that they have national access to communications. And then there's niche players that will go after military applications, places like Rocket Lab, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon. But really, SpaceX is sort of dominating the entire industry, and I think all these players are going to significantly reduce their market share. So getting a little bit further afield, I'll talk about the second thesis here, Sidedoor Ventures company Varda Space Industries. The thesis is essentially because you have these unique effects in microgravity, you can do really interesting things with industrial processes. So industrial parks in space manufacture materials that are impossible to make any other way. And to understand this intuitively, I love this picture for showing how different it is in space versus on Earth. If you've ever heard, heat rises, hot air rises, there's a reason for that. It's driven by gravity. So when you have hot air, it gets less dense. It basically floats on top of the colder air. And the currents that are generated by heating of the air from the flame is what generates that classic flame tip shape. When you're in space, there is no gravity, there is no density-driven flow. So everything is just diffusion-driven. You get the spherical flame. And you can imagine just how drastic the effects are in different chemical and physical systems that we can really take advantage of. So another example here, you can see boiling water in space versus on Earth. The bubbles really rapidly rise to the top of the water on Earth. In space, creates this very spherical, sort of agglomerating bubble as it gets larger. So there's all sorts of different effects to microgravity. You alter buoyancy, natural convection, sedimentation, phase separation, all these drive significant changes in transport-driven phenomena, which are used in almost every manufacturing process for materials on Earth. So Varda recognized the opportunity here and saw that there's significant changes in the launch and cost and cadence that makes this now economically viable to do on a commercial basis rather than just research and development. So their plan is essentially to launch raw materials, process them autonomously in space, and then return the finished goods back to Earth for use by people, and plan to eventually do this weekly, daily, or more because the revenue is only limited by how many launches they can do per year. So a really exciting example application, the one that Varda is focusing on first, is pharmaceuticals. So the microgravity impacts here on the left, all sorts of things that happen to the drugs when you process them in space. Particle nucleation and growth kinetics change. Particle sizes are more uniform. You get novel crystals, larger, more similar particles, fewer defects in the crystals. All this leads to actual tangible benefits for patients and for pharmaceutical companies that they can take advantage of in the market. So enabling new routes of administration, maybe something that you had to administer via IV, you can now take as a pill. Just really beneficial for people that have less access to medical care, and also makes it less expensive. There's improved bioavailability, so maybe something that you'd have to take a very large dose of now is easy to take. You can take in a lower dose, extended shelf life, reduce toxicity, and you can even discover new drugs that were impossible to make any other way that you wouldn't have found otherwise. And so just to remind you again of the markets that currently exist and their size, you're in the maybe double-digit, maybe triple-digit billion dollars. For comparison, pharmaceuticals has $1 trillion TAM just by itself. And there's single drugs, like Keytruda, for example, that have a TAM, a revenue per year of greater than $20 billion just for one drug. So there's a huge opportunity here compared to what's been done so far. And I think it'll be really interesting to see that expand. Next one, thinking about what does it mean to have a huge increase in the amount of mass that you can get to space each year? What does it mean that the cost is going down? This is another Sidedoor Ventures investment in K2 Space. So they're basically saying, we're no longer limited by mass. We can make things really large, go to space, and take advantage of this change in the fundamental market dynamic. So until today, or until 2010, you had these high-cost, high-performance satellites was the only thing in the market, the only opportunity. Recently, you now have low-cost, low-performance satellites, but there's still a gap that exists in the middle. How can I get high performance for low cost? So Starship, going back to SpaceX, is the answer here. Mass becomes functionally unlimited. You look at what they're planning to do in the future compared to what has happened to date. Huge reductions in cost, massive increases in how much mass goes to orbit each year. And so there's a paradigm shift happening where space becomes less like this artisanal, very hands-on process, something that happens, every once in a while. It's something that looks more like aircraft manufacturing or car manufacturing. There's this rapid cadence, routine, and becomes more commercially viable at large. So K2 Space is offering a unique value proposition here where they're saying, we'll offer you the same performance you get out of that gigantic, hard to get, costly satellite that you have in orbit right now, but we'll charge you a 10th or 100th price. And they're able to do this because the fundamental limitation of why large satellites need to exist is because of this scaling law with power density, with RF density. It just can't beat physics. So their plan basically is to go after these highly leveraged communication companies, the ones that are going to go under pretty soon if they don't compete with SpaceX, and say, hey, we'll give you a product that will allow you to survive longer, will allow you to get to market more quickly, will allow you to offer more innovative services, and basically compete against SpaceX, survive. So for scale, you can see just how enormous this thing is. That person is actually to scale compared to the size of the satellite, this gigantic satellite that's able to have very high power, very high throughput, and offer them a lifeline. And coming to the last thesis here, dual use. So you'll notice on the right side, these are both Starlink antennas. They're both doing very different things. The person on the bottom is working remotely from the beach, maybe answering some emails, joining some meetings. The person on the top is using the same product to wage war, fighting against Russia, commanding drones. And it's sort of an interesting dynamic that this same product is serving those two very, very different purposes. And this applies to actually many space companies, including all the ones that we talked about so far today. So just to give you some examples based on the companies that we talked about so far. Varda is doing pharmaceutical manufacturing. For commercial applications, for the government, they can offer hypersonic research and development platforms. They happen to come in the atmosphere at Mach 25 times the speed of sound. It's a really unique, innovative research platform for governments to get more data about how physics behaves at those speeds. You've got SpaceX, which is offering commercial launch and communications. The government is interested in those services as well. Not to mention the fact that they can build secure satellites for them at large scale, leveraging the communication satellites that build for commercial applications. And for K2 Space, the same is true. These large communication satellites that they can offer that break that cost versus mass paradigm are just as interesting to the government. So why is this interesting to the government in the first place? Well, you've got the ability to move faster. You're moving at a commercial pace now instead of the government contracting pace. They're better because they incorporate the latest commercial technologies delivered at rapid cadence. And they're cheaper because they're subsidized by the commercial market. So the government's not the only customer. They don't have to pay for all this innovation. They get to sort of draft off the commercial applications here. And why does it make sense for the companies and the investor? Well, typically you'll hear people a little bit scared to invest in frontier technology because the return on investment is such a longer time horizon versus something like an enterprise SaaS, or at least it seems that way. So for enterprise SaaS, you can introduce a revenue-generating product pretty early on in the life cycle, scales up exponentially over time. Compare that to a frontier tech company, which typically has a very large investment required to get to the first product to market, which also has a long delay time. So you get this long period of generating no revenue, but also investing lots of cash to make it happen, and then a step change in what they're able to offer in the commercial market with a slow growth after that. But the government has sort of recognized this dynamic. They recognize the value that they achieve by working with commercial companies. So they introduce these new products that they can offer to startups. Non-dilutive fund matching. So in the case of the US government, there's the StratFi program, which offers essentially up to $30 million dilution-free matching private investment to make sure these companies that are critical to national security, critical to national innovation can advance more quickly. So example here, Varda, they were awarded a $60 million Air Force contract to do the hypersonics research and development, which accelerates the roadmap for the pharmaceutical development as well. And so look how this curve changes. You get exponential growth in the SaaS side, but now you've got earlier access to revenue and capital from these non-dilutive fund matching programs through government entities. So early innovation programs like the SBIR program in the US, followed by a big step-up program for the StratFi program. That transitions into a government program of record for government applications. And then by the time you get to that point, you're ready for the commercial offering and can get a massive step up. So you end up having something that is actually more lucrative than traditional enterprise SaaS applications and actually allows you to underwrite bigger technical and market risks that have a higher upside on the back end as well. And I think you can see in the news lately that this is actually becoming really important. You know, the reason why the US government, why China, why Russia are thinking about defending against attacks in space is because these have become so fundamental to our core infrastructure, our core daily lives, that it's important to protect them. So you might have recently seen in the news that Starlink was the target of cyber attacks because this, what used to be purely commercial service, is now really influential in defense application. And I think this will extend not just from the US, not just from Europe and Australia, but to more countries as it becomes clear that having space assets is a national priority. It's needed for national security. It's needed for economic growth. So you start to see this in countries like the UK, for example, funding OneWeb so that they have guaranteed access to communication networks, just like the US does with Starlink. So in summary, I think there's plenty of opportunities that exist here. You know, there's really exciting things in the near term, but I think it's fun to think about, you know, what is the impact of this going to be in the long term? In my mind, once you get a critical density in space, once you have enough commercial activity, there starts to be an entirely new and entirely separate economy created, where you have space for space applications. You're creating this sort of revolutionary paradigm shift in how we approach economic activity. And it's an exponential growth pattern that's self-reinforcing. And as an investor, this is really exciting to me because it offers you an opportunity to catalyze the future, really invest in something that's revolutionary for all of humankind, expands the bounds of what we can do together, and it's going to generate this really exciting future. So I invite you to imagine what we can build together by investing in this exciting new space, and thanks for your attention.